to 81 countries to help them deal with this crisis. We also see steps to control the pandemics. As Prime Minister Trudeau said, we all learned to do this: wear a mask. And we are hopeful for vaccines, treatment, and more available testing. But we are not out of the woods yet. While there are signs of recovery, it is partial and even uncertain. The situation is particularly grave for low-income countries. They're hit by the pandemic and domestic contractions, by falling exports, by declining remittances, by low commodity prices, and small island economies by collapse of tourism. And yes, this crisis can put in reverse what we have achieved in the last decades to reach the SDGs and to bring poverty down, unless we act. And I want to focus on the mandate we embrace at the fund wholeheartedly for action. First, paramount to sustain support for people and businesses until durable exit from pandemic is achieved everywhere. For low-income countries and emerging markets with weaker fundamentals, this can only be done with international support. At the fund, we have tripled our concessional resources. We ought to do more. We have asked countries with strong position to allow us to use their SDRs to help countries in need. Some have already done it, Canada included. Thank you. And I urge others to do the same. Second, as we have heard from Antonio Guterres, we have to zero in on high and growing debt levels. I welcome the debt service suspension initiative, like Prime Minister Trudeau and others. I urge the G20 to extend it. This will provide up to $12 billion of much needed relief to participating countries. But we have to go beyond the DSSI. For a number of countries, low income and also some emerging markets, unsustainable debt levels are such that they would require debt restructuring. And we are keen to work with all parties, the creditors, the debtors, public creditors, private creditors, so we can have a orderly restructuring in place. We prioritize supporting countries' efforts to have sound debt management and debt transparency, crucially important. And of course, we have to look into the future. And I'm actually on the view that we should talk about building forward better, build the economy of the future, not replicate the economy of yesterday. And we at the fund are working with our membership so we can have a greener, smarter, more equitable economy for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed, Kristalina Georgieva from the IMF. You mentioned the tools in the kit in responding to the pandemic, the debt restructuring, the debt relief, the special drawing rights. You've issued a real rallying cry of how the less developed countries can be assisted by those that are more developed. Well, also the role of the World Bank is critical in this endeavour. So may I please invite to the floor now David Malpass, President of the World Bank Group. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Prime Ministers, Secretary General Guterres, Managing Director Georgieva, and Excellencies, I'm very pleased to be here today and see you all again in the discussion of development finance. After months of meetings, I understand that your working groups are finalizing a menu. I'd like to update you on the World Bank's development finance actions during this part of the pandemic. The pandemic is hitting developing countries especially hard. Our data shows that over 100 million people could fall into extreme poverty this year, with an additional increase in 2021, potentially bringing the number of new people living in extreme poverty to 150 million. The negative impact on health and education may last decades. 80 million children are missing out on essential vaccinations, and over 1 billion children are still out of school. The World Bank's 2020 Human Capital Index and report shows that the poorest communities are the hardest hit. Our first goal in the COVID response was for the World Bank to take broad, fast action early and to provide large net positive flows to the world's poorest countries. We put in place emergency COVID support programs in 111 countries, and we're making good progress toward the announced 15-month target of $160 billion in surge financing, much of it to IDA countries and to private sectors through IFC's trade finance and working capital support programs. For many of the poorest countries, unsustainable levels of public debt have become an enormous obstacle to development. Debt service crowds out the spending needed to tackle the pandemic's human tragedy, and the overhang from the stock of debt blocks new investment. Together with the IMF, we're making progress on debt transparency and relief. Our debt service suspension initiative has opened some fiscal space for participants, but the relief so far is too shallow to provide light at the end of the debt tunnel. Commercial creditors are not participating in the moratorium, draining the financing provided by multilateral institutions. Also, some major official bilateral creditors are not fully participating. This causes a further drain in resources. An added impediment is the lack of transparency in major contracts. We're working to extend and broaden the debt moratorium and lay the foundations for debt reduction, and would welcome the UN's vocal support for full participation by all official bilateral creditors, including national policy banks. Vaccinations will be a critical step in the recovery process. We're working to expand our fast-track COVID programs to include financing for the purchase and distribution of vaccines. Using grants, credits, and concessional funding, we will help prepare early to finance low and middle income countries that don't have access. In addition to our own sizable resources for countries, our COVID response programs are readily expandable through co-financing, and we invite your participation. The goal is to alter the course of the pandemic and help set countries on a path toward a more resilient recovery that builds new livelihoods. Countries will need to prepare for a different economy post-COVID by allowing capital, labor, skills, and innovation to move into new businesses and sectors. At the upcoming virtual World Bank IMF annual meetings, we will have a chance to discuss all these issues, including human capital, climate, digital development, and additional steps on debt reduction. If we take action early with the large creative programs and sources of financing I've described, we can help countries, as Kristalina puts it, build back better and stronger, build forward better and stronger, a greener, smarter, and more equitable economy. And I look forward to working with each of you on these important tasks. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed, David Malpass. So I see you and Kristalina are coming up together with a new slogan, build forward better. So let's see how that goes down at the United Nations. Thank you so much indeed, President of the World Bank Group there, for reminding us that what started off as a health crisis also became an economic crisis and is now a humanitarian crisis and is threatening to plunge millions and millions more into poverty. And so looking at this human cost of the pandemic. Somebody else who is sounding the alarm bells is Mark Lowcock, who of course is the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator at the UN. Mark Lowcock, please give us your thoughts on this very important matter. Thank you.
Zainab, thank you very much indeed. Excellencies, it has been a year of unpleasant surprises. The virus itself, of course, caught us by surprise. Many have been surprised by the severity of the global recession it's caused. But we've not been surprised that the recession has hit hardest in the 50 or so countries where 100 million people already only survive because of the help they get from humanitarian agencies like the ones I coordinate. Some, though, have been surprised by the speed with which the damage has been done. As David Malpass just said, for the first time since the 1990s, extreme poverty is going to increase. Life expectancy will fall. The annual death toll from HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria is set to double. The number of people facing starvation may also double. The carnage is concentrated in the most vulnerable countries. As Bill and Melinda Gates' new Goalkeepers report put it, the last 25 weeks threatens to unravel 25 years of development progress. It's worth remembering what many poor countries were like 25 years ago. I was working in a country then where a quarter of children never saw their 5th birthday. Most never went to school, and one woman in 18 died in childbirth. Do we really want all that back? No. All the more surprising then, that while the better off countries have, as Kristalina said, rightly thrown out the rule book to pump liquidity and fiscal support into their own economies to protect their own citizens, they have done so little to protect the poorest countries who don't have the capacity, resources, or access to markets to do the same thing. That's surprising first, since everybody knows what ought to be done. Many of the necessary actions, especially in mobilizing the international financial institutions to help the most vulnerable countries, were taken as recently as the 2008-9 financial crisis. It's surprising second, because much of what needs to happen would cost better off countries very little in fiscal terms, especially in the short term. And it's surprising third, because better off countries failing to take action now is not merely a failure of generosity or empathy. It is an act of self-harm. Like the virus, the problems that will be spawned by the huge economic contraction we are seeing will come back to bite everyone all around the world. All the poverty, hunger, sickness, and suffering will fuel grievances and despair. And in their wake will come conflict, instability, migration, and refugee flows, all giving succor to extremist groups and terrorists. The consequences will reach far and last long. And no one will be able to say they were surprised by that. So let's surprise ourselves in a positive direction. Let's take the obvious, cheap, self-interested and generous measures to mitigate all this now. Protect aid budgets. Extend and expand debt relief beyond the DSSI, as Kristalina has said. Issue SDRs and devote them to the poorest countries. And use the balance sheets of the shared financial institutions more energetically to protect the most vulnerable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed there, Mark from OCHA, for reminding us that we all rise and fall together. And some alarming statistics given there by Mark Lowcock. And of course, on the day that it's been announced that 1 million people worldwide have died from coronavirus, it's worth taking stock of the figures. But behind the figures are real human beings. And now to talk about the human cost again of the suffering, we have Natalia Kanem, who's Executive Director of the United Nations Population Fund. So Natalia, please give us your opening remarks and just reminding us that this is real suffering behind the statistics.
Thank you, Excellencies, distinguished guests. We've heard that as a result of the pandemic, poverty is set to rise for the first time in a quarter century with dramatic humanitarian consequences. Without a comprehensive global response, these negative impacts will spill into the lives of people everywhere. Smarter, deeper investments are needed like never before. The COVID pandemic reveals a stark truth. Human fates are intertwined, yet our common fabric remains alarmingly fragile. The consequences for young people who form the demographic majority in developing countries and are the engine of our future, especially girls, are dire. Imagine a girl. She's 12 years old. She loves school and dreams of graduation, a decent job, eventually marriage and a family. Now, her dreams are evaporating. Her parents are jobless due to the pandemic, and many nights she goes to bed hungry. No school, certainly no computer for virtual learning. Isolated by lockdowns, she lives in fear of coercion and violence. She doesn't yet suspect that she might never return to school because in a few months, she will be married off to lessen the burden at home, a year from now pregnant and caught in a merciless poverty trap that will jeopardize her health and hinder her productivity for the rest of her life and that of her children onward across generations. Society is poorer for it, global development threatened because of it. And just like COVID-19, the devastating ripple effects of crushing poverty don't stop at that girl's doorstep, nor at her country's border. Massive global investment is urgently needed to keep young people from the jaws of grinding poverty, from anger and alienation that gnaw at social bonds, and from lost potential that costs us all. This is a wake-up call. Additional investments in health, education, and development would save millions of lives, would provide women and girls the services they need, and yield economic benefits worth more than 10 times their costs. But if these investments don't occur now, the danger is future economic growth will wither. The opportunity for recovering better will be missed. Humanity is fighting to sustain the gains we achieved painstakingly over decades. That girl struggling for a viable future does not want perpetual dependency. She needs your leadership now more than ever, and we urge you to transform the rhetoric of resilience into reality. This means women at the table and accountable leadership to ensure that financing flows in the right directions. The first 5 years of the Sustainable Development Goals point the way forward, and the world needs that additional financing captured in these policy options before you for critical health, nutrition, education, and other essential services. COVID-19 will drastically shift the goalposts unless we answer the urgent demands with a smart and bold response. Let us act swiftly and in solidarity so that a 12-year-old girl may continue to dream, to hope, and to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed, Director Natalia Kanem there of UNFPA, for conjuring up that very powerful image for us of the 12-year-old girl, something that is really very, very striking in this coronavirus pandemic, and how, of course, it is often women and girls who suffer mostly in such tragedies. It's now my pleasure to invite Her Excellency Amina Mohammed, the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, who's going to introduce the upcoming high-level segment where we're going to have lots and lots of people from all over the world speak. But now, Amina Mohammed, Your Excellency, if you could deliver your opening remarks, please. We are all ears. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Zainab. Excellencies, distinguished experts, our dear colleagues and guests, over the past 4 months since the last high-level event on financing in the late May, leaders had called for concrete financing solutions to the worst health and development emergency in the century. And these have enabled robust debate amongst member states, our representatives of the UN system, regional organization, our institutional partners, and global thought leaders, and they have produced ambitious options. These options have further been debated in a meeting of over 50 experts in August, and then in September earlier this month with finance ministers. We've heard from all speakers today that the pandemic is still with us, and just how much conditions have deteriorated over the past few months, from a likely drop in global growth of more than 5% and nearly 500 million jobs lost, to near doubling the number of people facing starvation, a decline in life expectancy, and the heightened risk of instability, conflict, and refugee flows, and of course a massive loss of opportunities for women and girls. We've also heard from the World Bank and the IMF the spending that is being done at the country level. And in hearing from President Malpass, we've seen that it's too slow, too shallow, he said. But we also need to address the crisis now, and they are available for co-financing. Today, we are here to extend solidarity, not only to the most vulnerable who are in crisis, but also to the middle-income countries that are falling into crisis because of the absence of urgent action. The policy options before you can address liquidity shortages, avert a potential debt crisis, maintain jobs, and stop leakages from economies through illicit financial flows. But more than this, they can ensure that the recovery from the pandemic paves the way for an inclusive, sustainable, and resilient future, based on the ambition of our 2030 agenda and the Paris Agreement. Excellencies, allow me to highlight 6 short and medium-term policy options that have come out of the debate that we've had. The first is that ensuring the country's finances stay liquid through a general allocation of the IMF fund of special drawing rights and a voluntary redistribution of existing special drawing rights to developing and vulnerable countries, including middle-income countries. This is underscoring, of course, the call that we've heard from Kristalina Georgieva for some of our rich countries, like Canada, to make available their SDRs. And as she says, this helps us build forward an economy that is, of course, greener, smarter, and more equitable. The second is to create time for debt payments by extending the DSSI initiative till at least the end of 2021 and expanding its scope to cover all vulnerable countries, especially in Africa. The third, addressing the debt overhang by including all official bilateral and private sector creditors and engaging credit rating agencies in a dialogue on debt sustainability frameworks. The fourth, enhancing targeted funding to alleviate COVID-19, either by expanding existing funds and facilities or creating new funds, such as the FACE and the LSF. Fifth, clamp down on corruption and crime. The discussion groups proposed immediate action to end illicit financial flows by tackling enablers and vested interests that benefit from them, including preventing profit shifting by multinationals and bolstering the availability, transparency, and exchange of data on beneficial ownership. Recent revelations in the banking system show how important transparency and accountability in a timely manner are to stopping leakages from the economy. The sixth, making sure budgets promote investments in the SDGs and climate action. We need to align national and local budgets to build a bridge from short-term emergency responses to longer-term aim of a stronger, greener, just, and resilient recovery. Excellencies, as the Secretary General has said, recovery will not be complete until Africa has recovered, and the SDGs will not be achieved until they are achieved in Africa. current commitments made to African governments have yet to be fulfilled. Africa needs financial support urgently at a scale to implement African solutions to the African challenges in line with the Agenda 2063 of the African Union. Implementing the options that I have outlined, together with the commitments of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, will lay solid groundwork for a better future. Following today's meeting, we will continue to promote these solutions and feed this momentum and your political leadership into the IMF World Bank annual meetings, the G20 process, the Paris Finance in Common Summit, and the Paris +5 stock-taking at the end of the year. Excellencies, today we have in this virtual room yet another opportunity. With political leadership at the highest levels, we can take this initiative forward and translate ambition into action. Together, we must prevent the development crisis that we are facing, lest it deepen the humanitarian emergency that we are also looking at, and use the opportunity of a global response to recover better and achieve the 2030 agenda. Thank you for your leadership and for this really important engagement today.
Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed, thank you very much for your remarks. So, distinguished state and government, excellencies, gentlemen, we are now going to move to the high-level segment of this meeting on financing for development in the era of COVID-19 and beyond. So we're going to hear from heads of state and government from all over the world, across all continents, on how we can address this, the worst economic crisis for the world in a century. What are the needs of their countries? What are the kind of bold measures and policies which will help address their challenges and problems, and what role they would like the United Nations to play in supporting this recovery? So the order of the statements that we're going to hear from the heads of state and government and high-level officials is in accordance with the list of speakers for this segment. I want to remind very respectfully, but very firmly, because I have an iron fist in a velvet glove, that this segment is only 3 minutes per participant, because we have so many of you who want to speak, and I really, really beg your making sure that you really do adhere to that 3 minutes, and speak moderately also, so that the interpreters can do their job as best they can. And to assist you in the timekeeping, you will see that there's a timer visible on the virtual platform. So with that admonition out of the way, let me welcome the first speaker in this segment, and it is President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, also chairperson of the African Union. And Amina Mohammed there, Mr. President, reminded us that if Africa fails, then we all fail. So please give us your statement. Thank you.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished guests, and ladies and gentlemen, as we begin the task of reconstruction in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, financing for development becomes all the more critical. The overarching principle of Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals is that we leave no country behind, and that those furthest behind receive our full support. The pandemic has set back the SDG, and we now require additional financial resources to enable developing economies to respond effectively, not just to the pandemic, but to recover and to rebuild. The challenges facing developing economies have been compounded by weak public health systems, by limited social safety nets, high levels of inequality, high debt burdens, reduced tax revenues, capital outflows, and lack of adequate and sufficient access to financial markets. For Africa, financing remains crucial. As agreed by African finance ministers, Africa needs immediate emergency financing to the tune of $100 billion which would provide fiscal space and liquidity to governments. Our view is that the debt service suspension initiative in its current form does not go far enough. South Africa supports extending the initiative and, in certain circumstances, considering the cancellation of debt. We further welcome the focused attention that is being given to illicit financial flows, which pose a serious threat to the development trajectory and economic stability of many African countries. Developed economies must not renege on their commitments to support developing economies in the climate change adaptation and mitigation efforts. Means of implementation support must be dramatically scaled up to countries in need to enable them to meet their obligations under the Paris Agreement. The pandemic has vastly reduced the fiscal space of countries to meet their commitments to support development. But policy options going forward should not replace agreed multilateral outcomes, as reflected in, amongst others, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on financing for development. It is our hope that this platform will be used to accelerate the financing of the SDGs by the international community while recognizing the different levels of development of countries. Working together, it is within our means to eradicate poverty and inequality and to achieve greater economic and social justice, as well as to conserve our natural world for future generations. I thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, President Ramaphosa, current chair of the African Union, for your opening remarks there, the President of South Africa. We're now speaking on behalf of the least developed countries. We have His Excellency President Lazarus McCarthy Chakwera, President and Minister of Defense of Malawi. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President.
Right Honorable Prime Ministers of Canada and Jamaica, Your Excellency, Secretary General of the United Nations, Your Excellencies, I have the honor of addressing you on behalf of the least developed countries, LDCs. The world is facing a turbulent time amid COVID-19 pandemic. Though the pandemic is indiscriminate, its impact is different. Some advanced countries with strong fiscal space and robust resilience capacity are managing the crisis relatively well. In LDCs, the impacts have manifested in the disproportionate attainment of SDGs. Prior to COVID-19, the progress on SDGs was already slowing down. I therefore call for the full implementation of the LDC statement on COVID-19, which has been issued as an official document of the United Nations. We further call for a global stimulus package for LDCs in order to save our economies and societies from collapse. We need support for social protection systems and employment generation. We call upon development partners to fulfill their official development assistance commitments to LDCs by doubling the assistance. We commend the G20, the IMF, and the World Bank for the debt relief initiatives. However, these are not enough for LDCs. As the crisis unfolds, more LDCs are likely to default. We therefore call for a new global debt relief initiative for LDCs, drawing lessons from the previous heavily indebted poor countries initiative. All development assistance to LDCs needs to be grant-based to avoid further debt escalation. I reiterate the call for a special allocation of $50 billion special drawing rights, SDRs, enacting a voluntary redistribution of unused SDRs in favor of LDCs. On our part as LDCs, we must work hard and work smart in collaboration with our development partners to address climate change. We need to identify measures to expand fiscal space and foster their domestic resource mobilization by preventing illicit financial flows, base erosion and profit shifting, and facilitating contributions to the digital economy during the emergency and beyond. As we are preparing for the 5th UN Conference on LDCs to be held in 2022, we count on your support. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, President Chakwera there of Malawi, speaking on behalf of the least developed countries. We're now speaking on behalf of the landlocked least developed countries. We have the Prime Minister of Nepal, KP Sharma Oli. So please, Mr. Prime Minister, if we could hear your remarks, please.
Right Honourable Prime Ministers of Canada and Jamaica, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the group of 32 landlocked developing countries, LDCs, I commend the governments of Canada and Jamaica, as well as the United Nations Secretary General, for convening this high-level meeting. We welcome the timely initiative for coordinated and multilateral efforts on financing for development in the era of COVID-19 and beyond, launched on